If you were going to see the murder of a city, this is what it looks like. These were the words of Nathaniel Raymond, Executive Director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, speaking to the New York Times about the fall of El-Fasher. Once a bustling city, the capital of North Darfur was encircled and besieged by the paramilitary rapid support forces amid Sudan's chaotic civil war. For over 550 days, it held out against the RSF, resisting takeover even as medical care became scarce and famine took hold. And then, in October, its defenses finally broke. What followed was likely one of the worst war crimes committed this century. Victorious RSF fighters uploaded videos of themselves gunning down fleeing civilians or executing those pleading for their lives. The last remaining hospital was sacked, and medical staff and patients alike were slaughtered by the hundreds. It was, in short, an atrocity, one that caused shock across the world. Yet it's only now that we may finally be starting to grasp the true scale of what happened. Satellite imagery and a recent visit by the UN have confirmed what analysts feared. El-Fasher today is a ghost town. Markets are empty. Streets are overgrown with weeds. All signs of life have vanished. And that raises a horrifying question. At the moment that El-Fasher fell, the city was home to perhaps 250,000 people. 106,000 are estimated to have fled to nearby refugee camps, but the rest, they're just gone. They disappeared. Are they hostages? Are they in hiding? Or are they dead, buried beneath the vast desert? The only certain thing is that Sudan's genocide may be even worse than anyone realized. The Deadland. It reads like a spec script for a post-apocalyptic movie. On a desolate December day, a small team enters a city that once drew people from all over the region. But rather than a busy market town, the outsiders instead find just nothing, or more accurately, no one. Almost nothing beyond ruins and empty streets beneath the clear desert skies. But of course, this wasn't a movie. That city was El-Fasher in Sudan, and the small team comprised the UN's first visit since it fell to the RSF 2 months prior. As the UN coordinator in Sudan told El País, what is clear is that there were no thousands of people to see. It's like a ghost town. Even for a war that has already lasted over 1,000 days and featured mass killings and the destruction of the capital city, the fate of El-Fasher always stood out as particularly brutal. Placed under siege for over 550 days, its residents suffered levels of deprivation that scholar Abdel Nasser Salam Hamed compared to the siege of Leningrad in World War II. But it was what happened in October that has ensured El-Fasher's place in the history books. When the Sudanese armed forces chaotically retreated from their last stronghold in the suburb of Daraj-Ula, the RSF swept in and began a series of mass killings that may be unparalleled in recent history. Estimates at the time, both from Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab and from a private intelligence briefing given to British parliamentarians, placed the death toll at somewhere in the region of 60,000. To put that number in proper context, it took 21 months of war for the official death toll in Gaza to reach 60,000. In El-Fasher, it's thought to have taken less than 2 weeks. To be clear, no one knows the precise numbers killed in the city. Very few outsiders have been given access. No forensic examinations have been carried out. And what information we do have is pretty patchy. Some small changes in methodology can therefore produce wildly different death tolls. Still, the stuff that has trickled out in the last 2 months suggests that the fall of El-Fasher may have been even worse than initially reported. A theory backed up by the wealth of satellite imagery suggesting that something terrible happened here. Some of that imagery we already mentioned, the zoomed-in, pixelated photos of once busy streets, now empty and overgrown. The lack of signs of life around markets or water points and other places you'd expect people to gather. What we haven't yet mentioned are the satellite images of objects that look an awful lot like human corpses. Piles and piles of them, surrounded by stains that appear to be pools of blood. Yale labs have documented 150 of these piles around the city, mostly in areas where the paramilitaries are thought to have carried out mass killings. Most of them have since disappeared, replaced instead by signs of hasty burnings or burial. As the team noted in a mid-December report based on satellite imagery, quoting, RSF engaged in a systematic multi-week campaign to destroy evidence of its mass killings through burial, burning, and removal of human remains on a mass scale. This pattern of body disposal and destruction is ongoing. End quote. Just this month, the Sudan Tribune published its own investigation, concluding that, quoting, "Evidence of mass burials is also mounting. Sources identified several suspected mass gravesites. There are also reports of bodies being transported from the city to be burned or buried at night near the former refugee camp Zamzam to avoid detection." End quote. Then there are the other heartbreaking images captured by satellite. The Economist reports on the burned-out remains of cars clustered next to a vast earthen berm the RSF constructed around the city to stop civilians escaping. While the chain of events leading to this image is unknown, the likeliest explanation is that residents tried to flee by vehicle only for the RSF to bombard them with artillery fire. As such, Yale Labs has revised its possible death toll upwards. After initially giving 67,000 as an upper bound, Executive Director Nathaniel Raymond told the New York Times that at the end of 2025, 60,000 dead was now a plausible midpoint. The potential upper bound? 100,000 dead. As Raymond noted, quoting, "That pace of killing would be unrivaled since the Rwanda genocide." Again, we have to emphasize that this is an upper bound. Until war crimes investigators are able to access the city, we won't be able to get anything approaching a true toll. But even if the number killed in El-Fasher winds up being below Yale Labs' midpoint, it would still be one of the worst massacres in recent history. And that's not even taking into account the major question hanging over this entire episode. What the fuck happened to all those missing people? They're missing. Just before El-Fasher fell to the RSF, the UN estimated that it still contained 260,000 people. Roughly 106,000 are thought to have made it to refugee camps outside of the city, often walking for days through the desert without food or water. That leaves about 150,000 people unaccounted for. As we've already established, tens of thousands of them are likely dead, but that still leaves tens of thousands more whose fate is just unknown. And look, we know what you're thinking. Isn't the obvious answer that all those people are dead, Simon? To which we can only say, well, yeah, they may be. And if that is the case, then the fall of El-Fasher is likely the single bloodiest event to take place in the 21st century so far. But there are alternatives. Fates that, by some measures, may be even worse than death. And there are signs that El-Fasher's missing may be suffering them right now. The Sudan Tribune, for example, reports that the RSF set up a network of secret detention centers across the city, hidden in buildings as diverse as the local university's student dormitories and the city's Grand Mosque. To quote their coverage, "In these facilities, RSF fighters reportedly subject civilians to murder, rape, torture, starvation, and financial extortion. Conditions are said to be horrific, with deaths from disease and starvation common in the worst detention centers. Perhaps even bleaker is the fate of female detainees in Shala prison, where sources described, quote, deadly reports of sexual violence against female detainees, end quote. Other groups have accused the RSF of herding detainees into shipping containers and burning them alive. But while it seems likely the RSF are keeping hostages in awful conditions, this doesn't seem likely to account for all of the missing. A report in December by the African Center for Justice and Peace Studies, or ACJPS, suggests that at least 7,300 civilians have been captured by the paramilitaries within 3 days, which is a remarkably low number considering how many people were still in El-Fasher. That suggests that many others are elsewhere, not in the hands of the RSF, but that doesn't mean that they're safe. According to the Sudanese outlet Atar, most were likely kidnapped by herders and Arab communities living in the desert surrounding El-Fasher. Although it began as a political power struggle between two generals, Sudan's civil war has taken on an increasingly ethnic component. While to American or European eyes both sides would be coded as black, the majority of those fighting for the RSF would be locally known as Arabs, members of the nomadic tribes that once ruled the deserts of Darfur. These tribes are now broadly allied with the RSF in their mission to cleanse Darfur of black Africans such as the Masalit. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're as ideologically committed to genocide. In fact, reporting in Atar suggests their goal in kidnapping those fleeing El-Fasher is to exchange the hostages for cash. Not that the Abala, the local term for camel herders, treat their captives well. Here's a representative extract from Atar's reporting about the experiences of 32-year-old Mohammed Bakit and a small group of men that he traveled with. Quote, Bakit recounted that they were suspended by ropes at night and bound under the sun by day for 3 days, whipped until the marks were imprinted on their bodies, and denied food and water. On the 4th day, their captors demanded that they call their families to arrange a financial ransom, threatening to kill them if the payment was not made. End quote. In Beckett's case, his family managed to pay up and he was eventually released near the town of Tooele. Other men held alongside him were executed when their relatives couldn't find the money. Beyond kidnapping for ransom, there are signs that civilians may be being held for other reasons. New Humanitarian reported one man at the Tooele refugee camp who claimed he and others were taken to a small clinic by RSF fighters where blood was being harvested from young men. Whether that's true or not is impossible to say. Certainly it does sound lurid, like a tabloid story, but then so do many of the documented acts RSF fighters have filmed themselves undertaking. This is just not a group bound by ordinary ideas of morality. Not even close. In short then, the missing civilians of El-Fasher may not be dead, but they may also be trapped in a kind of living death. The lucky ones held captive by Arab herders until their families can pay a ransom. The unlucky ones disappeared into RSF torture centers, as bleak as anything constructed in Syria during the Assad regime. However, we didn't want to make this video only about the aftermath of El-Fasher. While its fall was undoubtedly one of the worst war crimes committed in decades, it's not like the rest of the war has been a model of gentlemanly conduct. As such, it's time for us to turn our attention to the wider conflict and the reasons to fear that another El-Fasher might soon be upon us. But before we move on to the next part of today's horror show, it's time for just a little bit of a breather. Thank God this episode is incredibly dark to tell you about hopefully something a bit lighter. Frontsco is our new subscriber service, a place where we go into greater depth on topics that the discourse tends to ignore. For just $5 a month, you get access to at least 2 exclusive videos every week, plus in-depth articles written by our stable of experts on important and overlooked topics. Since you're watching a video on Sudan, easily the most ignored conflict of our time, we feel comfortable saying that you care about under-the-radar stuff that definitely shouldn't be under the radar. WarFronts is intended to be an outlet specifically just for that. Just